the National Association of Scholars, and I'm welcoming you to the launch of the fifth of our Shifting Sands report, False Positives, the Irresponsibility Crisis of Science Policy. Now, I am moderating, but also co-author with, and therefore co-speaker with, Stan Young, the CEO of CG Stat and director of the Shifting Sands Project, and Warren Kinzierski, adjunct professor of environmental health at the University of Alberta School of Public Health. And all, the three of us have been the happy co-authors for all five of the Shifting Sands reports. The people who are going to be speaking today, first, Richard Williams, who worked at the Food and Drug Administration and is currently board chair of the Center for Truth in Science. And we don't have it here, but he's the author of a rather fun book on exactly how the FDA works. Richard, when you come up, you should mention the title of that because I don't have it at hand. We also should be having, yes, Marlo Lewis, our second commenter, is a senior fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and everybody is now here. Um, so as moderator, I'm going to tell you how this is going, and I think a little bit first about the background of this particular launch. The order is going to be Stan and Warren talking about perhaps the more technical parts of the false positives. Yeah, they're allowed to talk about policy, but I'll be concentrating on some of the policy as well. It'll be fun if there'll be overlap. Um, After we speak, yeah, ideally this will be less than half an hour for all three of us. We'll see how it goes. There will be two 12 to 14-minute talks. I believe that's Richard and then Marlo, although this is allowed to switch in case of preference. Um, and then it'll be open for digital Q&A. People, you should put in your questions, your comments, basically your questions, into the chat or into the Q&A buttons at the bottom. Either will work. If somebody starts doing it in one or the other, maybe be consistent and stick in that rather than the other. But I'll be looking at both. If your questions aren't answered, send them to me afterwards, randall@nas.org, and I will be glad to forward them to any of the participants so that they can have the option to answer you. And if you have to go, this is going to be on our YouTube channel, National Association of Scholars, within 24 hours. It will be here in perpetuity. If we say something embarrassing, we won't be able to get rid of it. So don't worry if you have to go, you'll be able to see this. Now, having said that, I want to give a little bit of an introduction. The Arthur Roop Foundation was extraordinarily kind and generous and supported National Association of Scholars for the entire Shifting Sands project. Particularly, we're grateful to Mark Henry, who personally had great interventions at Arthur Roop to make this possible. What we started from was um, we had published the irreproducibility crisis of modern science, which talked about how there is an irreproducibility crisis. Lots of science doesn't replicate, and it sure seems as if this would be affecting government policy. Well, okay, how do you go about proving this? Hence, this entire 5-year, 5-report project, which is looking at different areas of science, relatively different in their foci. And by the way, if you're looking at the chat, you can see, by the way, Chance Layton, our director of communications, is putting in links for how to donate and how to look at the full report series. Everybody look at the chat. Um, so, looking at air particles, PMT 2.5, that's environmental epidemiology. Looking at food, that's nutritional epidemiology. After the COVID epidemic, looking at public health, which also uses statistics and mathematical modeling, then going over to psychology, social psychology, implicit bias theory, and the implicit aptitude test, looking at that as well. For all of these, which all use statistics, as does an extraordinary amount of modern science, then providing a statistical test for controlling for multiple testing and modeling. Stan and Warren can get more into this, but the point is you can look at a small set amount of research, not try to reproduce and replicate 100,000 science articles, which is a little difficult to do, but simply say we've got really good statistical proof that there are entire fields which have been affecting scientific regulation that sure seem politely bunkum, hollow, and at the very least, shall we say, this government is not using really standard and obvious statistical tests that would lead them to say, wait a minute, we shouldn't be making regulations on this. We therefore think that with the 4 research reports we've done in the previous 4 years, we've gotten a pretty good basis of scientific data, statistical data. And this, by the way, our reports, where the core of them have then also been submitted for publication. They're now peer-reviewed, published articles, if not all 8 or 9 of the base ones. The vast majority by now are already, I think, in publication. Stan and Warren can say more about that. The point is, what we've come now to here is a synthesis why we think policy should be changed by the government in an extraordinarily wide variety of ways. We're going to say that, but the point is we built upon 4 previous reports so as to be able to say, we're not just saying this, here's why we're saying this. And if anybody wants to read the reports and wants to know why we're saying this, go look at the previous 4 for a fair amount of substantiation. Okay, this is the long, how did we get here from 5+ years of research? Having said that, Stan, and then perhaps, or Stan, Warren, Warren, Stan, would you like to say something more about the solid core of all this?
Warren will start. Put up the
Yeah.
slides.
Well, I'll start the presentation. I can say that using our methods, we've now published 10 studies in the literature since 2019. So just to give you a sense. So we're going to talk a bit about some of the insights of the university science problem. And as David alluded to, too many of these studies coming from researchers at universities have false results, essentially. Next slide, please. So starting back almost 40 years ago, Feinstein at Yale University had published a study noting that of 56 claims in the literature, about half were supporting what their claim, and the other half were against it. Now, if we fast forward almost 25 years forward, Stan Young and Carr published a study looking at observational studies, and 52 of them failed in RCTs. And at the same time, Bagley and Ellis published a study in the field of experimental biology showing that most, 47 of 53 studies failed to replicate. And similarly, Baker published a survey of scientists showing that 90% of them said there is a problem, with 52% saying the problem is severe. Next slide, please. Here in this case, elite university, Harvard. 3 methods that were developed in different areas, all originally from Harvard research. One in the area of nutrition science, the food frequency questionnaire. The second in the area of environmental epidemiology, looking at air pollution and health effects or deaths. And the third one in that area of the implicit bias, implicit association tests, and the social sciences. This gives you a sense of the number of hits in Google Scholar. These are citations that have followed up most of these studies using the methods. And by and large, most and all, or all of these studies have false results. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense, the growth in these particular areas, looking at citations per decade going back 40 years, all of these areas are continuing to grow enormously, keeping in mind that most or all of the results in these types of studies are false. Next slide, please. Let's give you some insights to why is that. One of the things that we looked at in multiple fields that we studied was trying to estimate the number of hypotheses tests that a typical study would conduct. And we're showing you what we observed here in the field of environmental epidemiology. Those first three bars are our published estimates for the median number of hypotheses tests conducted in these types of studies. That fourth bar on the right is where we combined all the data. And what we see is the typical number of hypotheses tests conducted in environmental epidemiology looking at air pollution health effects would be about 13,000. What is the meaning of that? Well, the benchmark that researchers use to denote a statistically significant result leads to 1 in every 20 hypotheses tests being a significant but false result. Given a typical study with 13,000 tests, one would expect to see 650 significant but false positive results. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Stan.
Yes, a p-value is what people use, and as Warren just said, you'll get a small p-value less than 0.05, 5% of the time, just by chance alone. The slide on the left, this figure on the left, is 69 p-values were computed looking at whether exercise will increase your longevity. And a p-value less than 0.05 is taken as statistically significant. Here you can see that the p-values range all the way from near zero to basically 100%. So the p-values are uniformly distributed, evenly distributed between 0 and 1. And the takeaway message is if you get answers all over the place, there's nothing going on. And so I just got back from exercise myself this morning thinking that I'm going to increase my longevity. And I'm obviously not paying attention to what I'm actually doing here. But exercise was tested many times for longevity, and the p-values are everywhere. That's a null effect. That's exercise. Probably your age of your parents and your genetics is deterministic. But in any case, the second one on the right, that's smoking and lung cancer. Well, we've all been told by our mothers from the time we were 3 or 4, don't smoke. Well, and here we have 102 studies where people looked at whether smoking was associated with lung cancer. And you can see all the p-values, except a few, are incredibly small. So one take-home message here is, yes, p-value plots can figure out what's real and what's not. But even on a fact that most people agree to, cigarette smoking associated with lung cancer, there are a few studies that were not statistically significant. If we switch to the next slide, things can be ambiguous. Life often is ambiguous. Here on the left, we see air pollution and premature mortality, 29 studies. There are probably 10 of those studies where the p-values are incredibly small, but then we see this 45-degree line coming up from the right. These indicate that there's nothing going on. So these studies taken together are ambiguous. Are the p-values that are small done through corrupt research? Are the p-values that are large, or they just didn't do a good job? It's ambiguous. On the right, we have another ambiguous situation, 71 p-values looking at asthma and ozone. Well, we talked to the physicians and everything. To induce an asthma attack, you need a large, usually protein molecule. Well, ozone is incredibly small, O3. And it by itself is not physically capable of inducing an asthma attack. So the biology behind all of this does not support that all those really small p-values are based on, some sort of biological reality. We'll go to the next slide. Office of Research Integrity. Wow, that sounds great. ORI. They deal with federally funded research. And they want to make sure that the federally funded money is dealing with integrity on what's going on. But if you look under the hood a little bit, there are multiple offices of research integrity. These are in the NIH, for example. NIH has 28 divisions, as I remember, and so they have 28 separate offices of research integrity. There are multiple offices, and they're uncoordinated. They're not proactive. They react to someone saying, well, this doesn't look right. And then they'll come in and they'll start doing things. But they're not doing p-value plots. They're not looking at whole areas of research. There's nothing systematic about what they do at all. They just react. It only deals with data fabrication. Well, Warren and I have been looking at statistical fabrication. And the Office of Research Integrity just backs up and says, no, we don't deal with statistical malfeasance. Investigation of bad science, once an item is examined and found, they turn it back over to the university to investigate. Well, this is the fox guarding the hen house. Universities like to have their people bringing in grants and so forth and so on. So yes, they will uncover and they will follow up on bad science, but their heart, I would say, is really not in it. Next slide. What can be done and by whom? University research is broken. Well over 50% of the claims coming out of many areas of university research fail to replicate. And the two things that Warren mentioned, over 90% of things aren't replicating. Bad science can crowd out good science. If you're a professor and publish 10 papers per year, you're going to get ahead of other professors that produce 1 paper per year. Well, how do you produce 10 papers per year? Well, it's much easier if you sort of do the kinds of things that Warren and I are looking at. Ask lots of questions, publish papers fast, and so forth. Deming was quite an interesting guy. I actually met him. He's dead now, but he was a top flight teacher of how you do industrial research. And he said that only the top person in a manufacturing organization can fix a broken system. You cannot depend on the workers to fix the system. They're generally happy where they are, and they're not going to say, well, we could eliminate half our jobs if we would just do X. Well, they're not going to say that. Deming said that you have to go to the very top, and that's not Congress, it's not universities, it's not researchers. In our system of government, it probably means the executive branch. And I'll say there are no cops for science. There are no laws. There are no prosecutors, no courts, no judges to police a bad system in the university. So the universities get to operate, self-governing and self-policing. And that system, based on the evidence, clearly is not working. And Deming would say it's not expected to work. So going to researchers and telling them to do better, he would say is essentially useless. The workers, universities, and researchers are happy with the current system. Next slide. Why is there so much junk science? Well, one thought is that the government buys research supporting the narrative that they want to push. So it makes sense for the EPA to fund researchers that find that air pollution is causing problems. Individuals buy goods with their dollars. I just bought some things from Amazon yesterday. It arrived today. Individuals vote with their dollars, and power is dissipated across lots of people. The university, the government, and the EPA is going to fund research that supports their narrative. Power is concentrated. We've said much university research stinks. Most industry goods and services are quite serviceable. I placed an order with Amazon yesterday. It showed up at my house today, or my new house today. Universities support top-down government control. A lot of the money coming to universities for research is coming from the government. Dollar voting divides power and promotes freedom. So that's a sort of a libertarian slant. And we'll turn to the next slide, which I think is the last slide. In summary, many university science claims narratives are demonstrably wrong. When you take an observational study from epidemiology and test it with a randomized large trial, the government spent $400 million on a hypothesis coming from epidemiology. The hypothesis was not supported in the randomized trial. Government funding doesn't always, but it can quite easily support self-serving claims. If you're in government and you want to do X, you lay out research to support which way you're going. Now, the naive belief is that research generates claims, generates government action, but it can reverse. The government can have a point of view, and they can fund research that supports that point of view, and they have enough money to crowd out large segments of the real researchers. Self-policing. It's been very humorous over the last 10 years or so to watch scientists getting together and saying, if we would only publish our data, and they have all kinds of elaborate sorts of things, Deming would say that is absolutely doomed to failure. The very good scientists will do good things. And yes, they'll talk amongst themselves, but it's not the good science that are killing us here. It's the bad science that's killing us. And they're not going to join together and promote methods and techniques that would put themselves out of business. One of my friends says, cut the funding, turn off the money, just, and that is exactly what has been happening with Doge and things like that. We hear a lot of squawking about it, certainly, but if we really want to control and fix the situation, it's got to be top down, and it's got to be, why would I go ask a crook to stop robbing banks? No, I would ask a policeman to go out and watch the bank. And right now, there are no police, no prosecutors, no judges, no nothing. So this is our attempt and summary over many years and a lot of thinking, and I'm happy to hear what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm now going to speak again on my own bat as, for the policy stuff. And I guess this whole idea of irresponsibility crisis, the basic thing is we have, as a nation, ceded a remarkable amount of power to people acting on the basis of science. An immense amount of executive branch power is being done on the theory that scientists will act according to professional norms for the benefit of everybody. And unfortunately, this has been, weaponized. That various radical activists have, taken this over. The fight for liberty, the fight for accountable and responsible government, it really requires focusing on science policy as a whole to make sure that science really is being done properly for the people and not just by self-aggrandizing bureaucrats and experts. In fact, there's a phrase in the report, degrees of intervention freedom, which the bureaucrats have taken parallel to the degrees of researcher freedom, which help cause the reproducibility crisis. And in effect, any bunch of bureaucrats can simply gin up a bunch of fake, irreproducible science to get whatever policy they want. And you got to try to keep this from happening. Now, we have four major baskets of reforms, which we suggest in this report. Government regulation reforms, education reforms, liberty reforms, and policy institute reforms. And let me just go into a little bit more about what each of those means. Regulation reforms, statute reforms. This is what Stan was just saying. There is some self-reform by scientists. There is some self-reform by, the National Science Foundation. They're a bit better than they were in 2005, and they're probably going to get a bit better, next year and next year. But either if you're optimistic, they're going to take 50 years to actually get real, bite to their self-regulation, or yeah, they'll never get to it because there's just so much you're willing to do. It has, and this, I think, is where we in our policy recommendations part ways with many science reformers who think reproducibility matters, but also just think it should be done by the scientists themselves. We're afraid, no, we just don't think that's going to work. That the track record for scientific self-reform is just too weak to rely upon. And it needs to be federal regulation and federal statute because the vast amount of money that comes from federal science, it both funds an enormous amount of it, the regulations cover an even more enormous amount, and in effect, it provides the norm for how all science is done. Everybody does their research as if they were looking for a federal grant, because by golly, if they're not doing it this year, they're going to do it next year. So you've got to shift and you've got to change the regulations and above all, change the laws because the permanent bureaucrats, maybe this is changing under this current administration, but it's still a work in progress. The permanent bureaucrats are not interested in changing the status quo. So you need statutes to change things. And we have got a bunch of things in detail, how precisely you should do this, and not in absolutely every detail, but getting into a fair bit more. I'll say, federal agencies should adopt resampling methods, multiple testing and multiple modeling as part of their standard battery of tests applied to research. Federal agencies should take greater cognizance of the difficulties associated with subgroup analysis. Federal agencies should require all studies that do not correct for MTMM to be labeled exploratory. These are the subheadings, and then we have paragraphs explaining them. The point is, simply saying you've got to do reproducibility requires more than just saying that, and we've tried to get into that into some detail. It is, by the way, wonderful that we have Marlo Lewis here. The Competitive Enterprise Institute, him and Darren Baxt have also been writing and publishing on that this year. They're doing really good stuff as our colleagues on this. And in effect, you should be not just looking at our stuff. You should also be looking at the CEI and hopefully more people who are wonderful colleagues in this and who have really good ideas of their own, in fact, which we want to steal the next time round. But this was already published by the time, or graphically designed by the time we got to reading their latest publication. So timing. All right, but the point is, there's a great deal of detailed work, obligatory statute that needs to be done. And I should say, not just for the science, but mathematical modeling. That's incredibly important. And that is, by the way, above all, the COVID crisis, the public health crisis, that worked on mathematical modeling as well. It's really important that when you're talking about getting the scientific research under control and reproducible, you also need the mathematical modeling to be under control and reproducible, transparent, accountable. And there's so many details. I'm going to stop with that. Education. And we've got, building upon some of the own NAS stuff, we do stuff like model science standards, the Franklin standards with freedom in education. We have stuff on reforming general education requirements at the undergraduate level. Recommendations separately for how to reform the finances of graduate study. The basic point is, too many people graduate from high school not knowing the basics of science. Too many science majors graduate from college not even having heard of the reproducibility crisis. Too many graduate students get their PhDs not knowing the proper techniques for experimental control, MTMM, how to use statistics properly when that is the petty change of modern science. You need scientific reform throughout. That means making the standards tougher in K through 12, improving teacher education. So you've got teachers who know about science when they teach it, and high school, middle school, elementary, making the general education requirements more rigorous, and then making the requirements for science majors and graduate students more rigorous. Some part of this is to make experts be better informed. Some part of this is to make citizens more able to be intelligently skeptical when they read about dubious science in the journalism. We need every person who graduates from high school to be able to say, wait a minute, I heard that you can muck around with statistics to jimmy up a fake result. When I hear that there's something I should be panicking and pulling my hair out about, maybe I should just take a look to see if there's anything in this newspaper article about whether they did the proper due diligence to make sure it's not just some gummed up, jimmied up fake report. This is civic education. Civic education now requires millions of students to have enough scientific knowledge to be able to hold self-appointed experts accountable when they claim whatever nonsense in the name of science. So education matters as much as all this federal policy stuff. Oh, and I will just mention two important things are with these science irreproducibility crisis. Some of it is deliberate misconduct. We've tried to be extremely careful about this. No scientist likes to be accused of misconduct or even letting it slip, but there is real misconduct. We try to be careful in what we say. In effect, what we're doing, if you prevent slipshod science, you prevent deliberate misconduct from happening. But we do also have policy meant to tighten up on actual deliberate research misconduct. And one can be as careful and polite as one can be, but that there are bad apples and we do need to shift policy because of them. For the education, I just want to make a particular shout out, legal education. An incredibly large amount of science policy is made in the courts by judges and juries. We have recommendations for, better education in science in law school, continuing legal education for judges and juries. If you improve general science education, it helps juries. But the point is, legal education and the law are incredibly important. You need to pay attention to those and not just federal regulations and policies. All right, so this leaves, I'm trying to go relatively quickly, Liberty and the Science Institutes. Liberty. People are forgetting just how horrible the COVID crisis was. We had one of the worst, destructions of liberty in the country, and people are frankly already forgetting about this. Some of what we did was trying to point out what went wrong. As far as I can tell, the public is sort of trying to forget about this rapidly. And I would say, in effect, a large amount of the public is trying to say, okay, you mucked it up once, don't do it again. And every professional is saying, yeah, we'll do that again the next time we can. Um, People shouldn't forget about this. We need to have, commissions, policies focused on liberty. I mean, what's being, having Robert Kennedy and Jay Bhattacharya in at Health and Human Services is really important. There's real promise there, but it can't be them alone. Everybody else needs to remember that science reform includes the protection of liberty, and that includes, looking up to see what is artificial intelligence doing? What do the social media companies do? Are you are you charting free speech the way you would chart it as a disease and coming up with ways to inhibit free speech the way you would try to inhibit a disease, which is, what the more eager and adventurous are trying to do. But the point is, this is not just a question of nickels and dimes. It's not just a question of government accountability. This is that the government bureaucrats threaten each and every one of us, our individual liberty, and we need to make that one of the four pillars of science policy reform. And then the fourth one, science policy institutes. With the greatest of respect, and and I say this given that, say, both Richard and Marlowe are working on the science policy beat in science institutes. So, like, look, there's people out there. They're here. We asked them. There need to be more. And I can, I, Heritage, AEI, everybody, they do some, they need to do more. And our argument is it's not just a particular issue. It's not just about, PM 2.5. It's not just about food. It's not just about climate change. It is about science as a whole. The culture of science, the society of science, the government of science, how we approach this, and the way this is going to get done has to be through really large effort by policy institutes to inform legislative assistants, inform the subjects, get it onto the radar, for actual elected officials, and to make the hardest argument of all, which is not just that this matters, but that this matters more than the other really important priorities our friends want to do. And so, to tell, I don't know, to tell somebody in, the Trump administration, shall we say, for a hypothetical example, we know that you have limited political capital, and we know that securing the border matters, and we know that, making peace between Russia and Ukraine matters, and we know that getting DC crime under control matters, but you've also got to expend capital for the basics of science policy reform. And making the argument to a friend, everything else matters, but this matters too, is the hardest thing to do. And for that, we need dozens, we need hundreds of people working on this full time in science policy institutes, on the federal level, on the state level, having different foci for subjects, some of them perhaps focusing on the law rather than federal, some of them focusing on environmental epidemiology, some of them focusing on statistics, but all with the same larger goal in mind. And So this report is trying to be a sort of a John the Baptist, John the Baptist come to Jesus moment. It's coming, and we're proclaiming what needs to be done. Details need to be spelled out, gospel to follow. But this is where we're starting from. All right, that's where I'm going to stop now and leave it to Marla, was you or Richard who was going first?
I don't know, but if Richard would like to go first, that would be fine, or I could go now.
I'll go, Marla. That's fine.
Okay.
So, Chance, can you put the first slide up?
Yes, sure thing. Just switch off here.
Okay, while he's doing that, David asked me to mention the book that I wrote, which you might find interesting. It's a lot of stories about what actually happens inside FDA, which if you're from FDA, you know you're not supposed to write that. But it's called Fixing Food, and FDA Insider Reveals the Myths and the Solutions. So if you like stories and some of it is about science, hopefully you'll like that. First, I want to start. Congratulations to the team for producing this report. I read it all the way through twice carefully, and I think it is just excellent. So I'm going to talk about public health because that's the field I've been in for almost 50 years now. And the last 50 years or so, we have seen an expansion of public health, and Shifting Sands covers this, and one of the main causes, which is this expansion due to misuse of statistics, particularly generating false positives that are used to supply proof that government intervention is needed to resolve issues. And I'm fascinated with all the areas, but I'm going to focus on public health and nutrition. We are constantly told, follow the science, but I want to paraphrase Mark Twain and say, what they claim to know ain't so. So it's not necessarily something we ought to do. Chance, go to the next slide. So this is just a really quick overview of what's happened in public health. In the 18th century, public health was all about stopping the spread of contagious diseases like smallpox, typhoid, and cholera. By the 19th century, we had moved to what can we prevent contagious diseases? And so we had, for example, scurvy. And public health basically said, you know what, if sailors take limes, that will prevent scurvy. Public health departments were just starting to be considered, but it was really the 20th century when we first got public health agencies. First one we got was FDA in 1906, and it was necessary. We had rats running over meat, and we had food processors were intentionally adding additives that were poisonous to make the food look better. But then in the 20th century, and particularly in the 21st century, you have now seen public health sort of go nuts into all sorts of areas. And why is that important? I think there's a number of reasons. One, as David mentioned, we have scared people into limiting liberty. And I think that's important. Certainly the COVID was a good example of that. We spend enormous amounts of resources right now, but we have very little results in terms of improving public health to show for it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I think one of the issues that's happened is because of these things, we've reduced the trust in the agencies, and we've seen that in polls. And finally, there's been a lot of unintended consequences of bad policies based on bad science. I'll just give you one quick example. In the 80s and 90s, we focused on reducing total fat. Turned out that wasn't a good idea. It wasn't an issue, but we got a lot of sugar to replace it. Chance?
Thanks.
So, what's coming? Well, Department of Health and Human Services have been doing these healthy people reports every 5 years since 1980. I will point out in 1980, the obesity rate in the United States was 15%. It's well over 40% now. But the point is, and these are all the agencies under HHS, FDA, Centers for Disease Control, NIH, and so forth. They've expanded what the questions are. So here's some of the goals that they have in this 2030 report. Higher quality educational opportunities for children and adolescents, a good thing, but what's it have to do with public health? Less bullying, reducing poverty, reducing the number of families that spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Again, public health, but more publicly provided health insurance, drug insurance, dental insurance, and birth control. Increase access to broadband. Increase the number of people who are hiking, biking, and using mass transit. Reduce parents' prison time. Increase the number of people that kids can talk to. And it goes on and on and on. There are hundreds of them like that. Why public health for all these things? Well, who's doing it? Chance will go to the next one. So what I call them is it's our regulatory agencies. To me, they're the modern day wizards of regulatory science. And this includes not all those just those agencies in Department of Health and Human Services like FDA and CDC, but now USDA, which was actually created during the Civil War, EPA, DOT, and Labor, and of course all the other ones. Since 2010, the agencies have been supposed to tell you what they plan to do, how they plan to improve public health and have specific measures, and then report on them at the end of the year. You haven't seen those because they don't do them. They're not accountable. Instead, what they do is they gin up a lot of often phantom risks that are not real. Then they assume once they have that risk, they say, well, we're going to assume we have a solution that works. And it's pretty much assumed. They don't always work. And they never follow up to see if what they've done has any results. Instead, what they do, like the wizard, they just rattle the drum and blow smoke, and the public again is told to follow the science. So they just bluster and they're impossible to change. Go ahead, Chance. So this has been gone over 20 years of indictments, maybe 40 years. John Ioannidis was the first. He said that most claimed research findings are false. But what impressed me was you have the New England Journal, editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, saying that you can't trust most clinical research. The chief of Lancet, again, these are two of the top journals in science, and it says much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may be untrue. And finally, a recent report, 2025, over 2/3 of landmark cancer studies cannot be reproduced. So these are terrible. And the question is, who's involved in it? And I think in every sector of science, there are problems. Journals, they're seeking headline results, and they want all positive studies. Only recently have they started publishing negative and null results. And a lot of times what they publish is editorial favoritism. The media then take these results. They're happy to publicize them. They don't question new studies. In fact, they used to, it seems. And they never, of course, put them into context with the existing science. Government, as was mentioned, government is seeking science basically to find problems that they can regulate. And they suppress scientists who don't disagree. I know a lot of scientists who had a grant from the government. They found something the government didn't want, and they were cut off immediately. The academy is certainly churning out some scientists without understanding these issues. As David pointed out, they're granted tenure and promotions based on their positive findings in big journals. We still have the publish or perish issue. And then there's the activists, nonprofit activists, and it seems like many of them are just focused on scaring people to call for more government intervention. And finally, as David mentioned, we've got the toxic torts in the courts, and they use bad science to punish successful companies. Chance? So the question is, what can we do to reduce the scope of public health? And I think there's a lot of good things in this report that I want to commend, and I would not have anywhere near enough time to talk about all of them. One of the things that they use is the word should for regulatory agencies. Having been in a regulatory agency for a long time, I can tell you should doesn't work, and I think this report does say that. You have to have not just an executive order, you really do need a law, and it's got to punish their money. Regulatory agencies don't pay any attention to anything unless it affects their funding. Weight of evidence was discussed as reforming weight of evidence. My view of weight of evidence is there is so much bad science out there. You don't have to cherry pick to get the results you want. All you have to do is summarize what's out there, and you're going to get the result that you want. I think you have to end weight of evidence. Perhaps in favor of systematic reviews. And I don't think weight of evidence will be good until we have a number of null and negative studies published so that weight of evidence begins to make sense. And that may not be for decades. One of the things that they didn't mention that I think goes hand in hand with this report is reforming the Administrative Procedures Act. This is an act from 75 years ago that basically tells regulatory agencies how they have to pass regulations. Here's the issue. Suppose you find something like a false positive or something that you don't like, and you comment on it to the agency. The agency is required to respond to those comments, but here's how they can respond, and they often do. You didn't submit enough data, so we're going to ignore you. Or simply, the agency disagrees with you. That's it. So there have been a lot of calls to reform it, perhaps send them back to administrative courts where the agency has to actually defend what their response is. So the good news is we have some things in process right now. Loper Bright, this overturned a 40-year-old decision called the Chevron decision. And what it says is when Congress passes a vague law, agencies have always gotten deference from the court saying, okay, well, if this is your interpretation and you're going to expand your remit, we're going to have to agree with the agency. Loper Bright says they no longer have that deference. That doesn't mean courts can't give them deference, but it's not automatic in the law. So that's a good thing. That may act to constrain agencies. I would suspect they're going to be in court a lot trying to defend their interpretations. And so this limits this use of bad science to expand what they're doing. The one I'm most excited about personally is precision health. Chance, could we turn it? So historically, we look in the tails of distributions for people who are either highly exposed or highly sensitive, and we pass an entire population regulation just to protect the few people that are in the tail of the distribution. But in point of fact, it is true there are highly sensitive and highly exposed, but we're much more diverse. New science is showing us than we previously believed. Even genetically, we're more diverse, and certainly epigenetically, where your genes are turned on and off. We're quite diverse. What we now know is a lot about the microbiome, and particularly the gut microbiome. And everybody has a different mix of microbes in your gut. So there's one source of diversity, and microbes control a lot of your public health. I don't want to get into, excuse me, of your health. I don't want to get into that, but a lot. And just for example, suppose you have two identical twins and you feed them the exact same meal. They will respond metabolically differently to that meal, meaning they're not alike at all, which means we are all different. Okay, so this is really, then if you take everything else into account, your health status, your diet, exercise, your environment, your preferences, you get very, very different individuals. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing new monitoring devices come out. They're really just in their infancy, but they're going to start measuring a lot of these things to give you individual advice on what to eat, where to live, how much you should eat, how much exercise you should have, what medicines you take, and so forth. All of this will be done using big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and here's the key for the next, hopefully what you guys will do for your next project, better statistics. We need really, really good statistics to take into account all of this massive data. Go to the next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the complexity of the things that we're going to take into account with precision health. And precision health includes precision or personalized nutrition and personalized medicine. So what we're going to need from biology and biostatistics is we're going to have to go from associations, hopefully positive, hopefully true associations in unvetted biomarkers to causation with validated biomarkers. So we're really going to need to know for something that's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years in the future, are the biomarkers accurate? Are we measuring them accurately so we know if we're making any improvements? That's going to be a real issue, and it's going to be certainly an issue for the statisticians. Regulation, a whole lot of things are going to happen. Clearly, right now, we're pre-clearing all these devices. They have to go through FDA. Every time you make a change in them, you have to go back to FDA and get it pre-cleared again. That's really not going to work for the future. We're going to need better biomarkers. We're certainly going to need better algorithms. A lot of this data is going to be private. It's going to need to be protected. And, you know, is FDA going to try to regulate advice people give, or how are they going to regulate these things? I think one of the things we're going to have to do is move away from absolute standards to relative. Are we improving on a relative basis? Again, I don't think this is quite ready for prime time, although people are doing it already. I think we're going to have to, in the interim, we're going to have to look at healthy foods. But I think certainly we can start by getting the statistics right. Now, what does all this have to do with liberty? A couple of things are going to happen as we move into precision health. One, population studies. Population studies are going to be useless unless they tell us something about how individuals react to challenges. So population advice, which we get a ton of, not just in government, but in the private sector, it's useless, okay, because it's different for everyone. For example, a food can be healthy for someone and unhealthy for another. Taxes and subsidies, they're not going to make any sense anymore, okay, because really we're going to know a lot more about individuals. We're not going to need to do that. It's individuals taking care of themselves. So treatment will be done by individuals, not the government. And perhaps there'll be a cadre of healthcare professionals who will be assisting them with use of these devices. So we're going to need better statistics, better biology, probabilistic risk, and I think we're going to need the freedom to invent. And finally, I just want to suggest that I think this project is going to be a much more complex problem to solve than the one that the Manhattan Project did. So I'll stop there because I'm really looking forward to listen to Marlo.
Thank you so much. Marlo.
Well, Rich, that was one of the most hopeful presentations about any matter of public policy that I've heard in a long time. And it sounds great. And I know from personal experience, the fact that only in my 70s did I discover that I have celiac disease. Did I realize, it hit me like a ton of bricks, that eating your Wheaties is not necessarily good for you. It may be great for, Mickey Mantle, or whoever used to be featured in those advertisements. But yes, we are all very different, and that was a fascinating presentation. And I just hope I'm around long enough to see precision medicine come into its own. I guess we all probably feel that way. Anyway, I'm just thrilled and delighted to be here, and I want to thank you, David, for inviting me. And I want to say that you and Stan and Warren have just done irreplaceable work. You are the leader. I mean, you lamented the fact that there aren't enough think tanks doing the same thing. It kind of reminds me what people used to say about the Grateful Dead. It's not that they're the best at what they do. They're the only ones who do what they do. That's almost the case with you guys, because for years, I mean, for over a decade, as far as I know, you have been explaining and documenting the irreproducibility crisis and articulating its threats to liberty and developing legislative reforms, which I agree, only through legislation can you bake these quality control standards into public policy on a lasting basis. Because we know, well, just to give an example, the EPA under the first Trump administration had a science transparency rule, which had a lot of good ideas, and was a very mild, talk about a modest reform. All they wanted to do was, other things equal, give more weight to studies that are reproducible than to studies that are irreproducible by virtue of their, it was principally by virtue of their inaccessible data. And the public health establishment and the environmental establishment and the Democratic Party, maybe I repeat myself, just came down on them like a ton of bricks and vilified the whole exercise. Senator Cory Booker, I recall, said that what the transparency rule proposed was that we couldn't use health data from a public health disaster, such as the release of toxins that killed hundreds of children. I don't think he actually had an example that he pointed to, but he gave that as a hypothetical. We couldn't use that data unless we reproduced the disaster. So, I mean, there were, I believe, let's see, his name was Richard Holt. He was the president of the AAAS, the American Association for the advancement of sciences at the time. He said at a Senate hearing, he didn't agree, he didn't affirm in detail what Cory Booker had said, but basically gave his imprimatur on that caricature of the transparency rule. One of the problems with that rule was that the EPA at the time got cold feet when it was challenged. It was challenged in this way: show us in any of the statutes that EPA administers that best available science is ever expressly defined in terms of transparency and reproducibility. And there was no such language, all right? And so the EPA at that time then retreated into its housekeeping authority as the basis for the transparency rule. Well, it didn't hold up in court, so that was a mistake. But what amazed me then and amazes me still is that they didn't simply say, look, those same statutes also don't define what science is, because those statutes assume that these agencies, who are full of experts, have some idea what science is, and science has to do with repeatability. If the results of an experiment don't repeat, then those results are not science. If the conclusions drawn from an observational study can't be reproduced, at least mathematically, then that's not even close to being science. And so they should have emphasized the inherent connection, linkage, if you will, between science and reproducibility, and reproducibility and transparency. You know, how are you going to reproduce someone's results when you can't even see what they did? I mean, it can be done in the experimental sciences, but even then it's more difficult. It's all transparency is either an aid to a reproducibility testing or indispensable to it. They didn't make that case, but you folks have made this case relentlessly, and I think you've helped to educate others in the liberty movement, including me. And I want to personally thank Stan Young for his many patient conversations to me. I'm telling you, the Shifting Sands Report 1 on PM 2.5 was just absolutely indispensable. I wrote a chapter on modernizing EPA science policies for this book, this Competitive Enterprise Institute book. There is no way in the world I could have written it without your chapter, and also without Stan's patient collegial help to a relative stranger. I mean, I think I had met him once in my life, and you know, if ever I called and asked, hey, can you explain this a little further, he always did. One of the things that our movement needs to think about at some point, and I know that you're already doing this, is the funding aspect, which we did touch upon today. You know, the EPA, for example, probably funds, I don't know, 90%, 95% of all PM 2.5 epidemiological research. So the whole industry, because that's what it's become. I mean, EPA has provided well over $225 million since the turn of the century on 7 PM centers, research centers, or 8, I think, if you include the Health Effects Institute, for which it funds half the research. But that is an industry that their funding created, and it's so EPA centric that there is no way that there could be real dissent among the ranks there. There just isn't. And this problem, I would note, this or what you might call the paradigm for it, goes all the way back, you know, to the Eisenhower era. In fact, Eisenhower pointed it out in his farewell address. We're all familiar with his famous warning against the accumulation of power, whether deliberate or not, by a military industrial complex. But he also was very worried about how government funding for scientific research in general, not just military related scientific research, would corrupt the academy and also undermine democratic accountability. And basically what he said is that more and more a government grant has become a substitute for intellectual curiosity. I think what he meant by that is that pleasing the grant maker becomes more important than seeking the truth as an incentive that plays upon the hearts and minds of the government-funded researchers. And so you can see how if you have a whole industry that's really dependent on a government as the source of its money, that it would become very easy for disciplinary groupthink to take hold in that academic discipline, because you wouldn't want to offend the pieties of your patrons. But he also said, he warned of what he called an equal but opposite danger. I don't really think it's opposite. I think it's the other side of the coin. He also worried that, quote, public policy itself could become captive to a scientific technological elite. And I would say, yeah, especially if the government funding of that research is promoting disciplinary groupthink. And of course, this is exactly what we see in many fields. The one that I'm most familiar with is air pollution regulation and also climate change. And now the EPA doesn't have a major role in funding climate studies, but the EPA is part of a US government global research program, which has a major role. It's probably, again, about 90% of all climate-related research in this country is funded by the government, and the results have not been pretty. So, for example, if you do a Google Scholar search, you'll find that there are two emission scenarios that have been treated improperly as baseline emission scenarios. In other words, business as usual. This is what inexorably happens unless not just the United States, but all governments in the world gang together in order to force fossil fuels out of the energy economy of the world. They're called RCP 8.5 and SSP 8.5. And so the most climate studies, especially the vast majority of climate impact studies, use these scenarios. And these scenarios were basically derived from older scenarios, which all assumed that the world left to its own devices would return to a coal-based energy economy. In other words, that by the year 2100, coal would occupy the same market share that it did in 1940, before nuclear power, before natural gas. And so what you get are scenarios which now are widely acknowledged to overestimate the emissions, global emissions of greenhouse gases by more than a factor of 2 by the year 2050, and more than a factor of 5 by the year 2100. So this is a highly warm biased scenario, and these were used as the baseline business as usual scenarios in the IPCC's 5th assessment report in 2013 and 2014, and the IPCC's latest 6th assessment report in 2021-2022, also in the IPCC's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. That was the report that didn't really claim, but was reported to claim, that we can't allow global warming to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius or all hell breaks loose. These were also the basis of the fourth U.S. National Climate Assessment, which came out in 2017 and 2018, and the fifth one that came out in 2023. So these proved to be wildly implausible, and later research, which is done by a gentleman who about whom I have the greatest respect, Roger Pilkey Jr., who's over at the American Enterprise Institute. He shows that the new baseline agreed to by the IPCC and now by the EPA under Biden, it's called SSP 2 4.5. So in other words, instead of the greenhouse gases resulting in 8.5 watts per square meter of warming pressure by 2100, it's only 4.5. So it's just a little more than halfway to what the previous alarmist scenarios projected. But anyway, even that is too warm. Pilkey and other scholars show that really we're on a trajectory, an emissions trajectory, closer to 3.4 watts per square meter by 2100. So that's even cooler. Anyway, it's and look, there are other problems with the climate science that are just as significant. You take these emission scenarios and you run them through models, all right? And so the models themselves are tuned in various ways, and whether the models are accurate or not in forecasting what's going to happen to global warming and the other climate impacts, depending on what emission scenario you run with them, depends to a large extent on something called climate sensitivity. What the models estimate is how reactive the atmosphere is, or the climate system is in terms of temperature to these increases. And it turns out that all these models have been overestimating the observed warming of the past 45 years by more than a factor of 2, especially in the bulk atmosphere, the troposphere, which is where the greenhouse effect mostly occurs. So, but there have been literally hundreds of billions of dollars put into this research. And why has that happened? Well, because then you can make the case that we have to do this. We have to spend trillions of dollars on regulations. Otherwise, we're doomed. And it's just nonsense. Climate change is real, but it is not. There is no solid evidence at all for a crisis, an existential threat, the end of life as we know it. But this has all been propped up by government-funded research, and it's the very kind of abuse of power, the very kind of irresponsible science leading to irresponsible policy that you, David, and Stan and Warren have talked about in this latest number 5 edition. And by the way, I just think that's a brilliant formulation. Irresponsible science policy leading to irresponsible regulation, or irresponsible policy. So we have a crisis of irresponsible policy. I think that's just spot on. I just want to say one or two other things, if you will. The first is that after learning about the irreproducibility crisis and the fact, for example, that you can find over 90,000 entries in Google Scholar on the reproducibility crisis and over 665,000 on the replication crisis. These are basically, different names for the same thing. But these are all individual studies. I went looking when I was trying to figure out what EPA was up to, what EPA says about the irreproducibility crisis. And so I looked at EPA's scientific integrity policy, okay? They came out with a scientific integrity policy. It's a long document in 2012. Well, that was well after Ioannidis's seminal article, right? And then they updated it. They handed it off as a present to the incoming Trump administration in January 2025. You cannot find the word reproduce or replicate or any related words in either of those documents. So far from the EPA having a plan to improve the transparency and reproducibility of the science that it funds and assesses, it didn't even mention the elephant in the room. Okay, no mention, no acknowledgement in its scientific integrity policy of the reproducibility crisis. Unbelievable. The only other thing I want to mention here, because in our book we have numerous policy proposals or legislative proposals, which I think track very well. They're very similar to the ones that you've developed. Here's a very modest proposal that I think would be helpful. And I got the idea for this from my colleague, Wayne Cruz, who is a regulatory analyst who's always saying, we just need checklists. If the checklists, shed sunlight on what government is doing or failing to do. So here was my simple idea for a checklist. I would call this the Reproducible Science Checklist Act. Okay, so whenever the EPA publishes a proposed rule and then the final rule, it usually lists all the scientific studies that it consulted in order to determine the regulatory standard, the emissions standard, the national ambient air quality standard, what have you. So the EPA in each of these rules from now on should be required to provide a table, all right? And the table would have many rows as there were studies, but then maybe 10 columns, each having to do with a science quality control requirement. So for example, in column 1, the EPA would report whether the study would have either a check or an X, or a Y or an N, whether the study has a time-stamped, pre-registered hypothesis and research plan. Yes or no? All right. And in column 2, whether the study has a time-stamped archive of the original data prior to data cleaning. And in columns 3, 4, and 5, whether all the data, models, and code are accessible for independent review. In column 6, whether all the results, negative as well as positive, are reported. In column 7, whether changes in research methods are duly recorded. In column 8, whether the study has been tested for reproducibility. Maybe in column 9, whether it's actually been reproduced, because that's even more important. In column 10, whether the researchers have estimated the study's search space, which is your great innovation, I think. And then maybe in the next column, whether the researchers applied the Bonferroni correction, which I learned about from Stan, when determining the statistical significance of a study that poses 13,000 questions with at least 650 false positives. And so, just that, I think, would put a lot of pressure on the EPA, and then from the EPA in turn on the research community to come clean about what they're doing or not doing to clean up their act. And with that, I will conclude.
Thank you so much. So we have fairly limited time before we're supposed to end. I'm going to go to what I think is perhaps the most general question, and therefore I think the best thing to start off with. Dr. John Broom, so I'm a historian, not a scientist. Should we trust anything in the science field? Is it mostly like history, more interpretation than science? And I'm going to be greedy and seize a first answer because I'm also a historian, so I get dibs. And because in effect I was also approaching this coming into science policy, with a historian's background. The most important thing I think is to say, if something hasn't been reproduced, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. It means that it's not proven. And the point is that we're supposed to be making science policy based upon stuff which has been, reproduced, proven, lots of, ideally a fair amount of science proving it. So you're supposed to suspend judgment. And that's somewhat different. Now, practically, there are then concentric circles. If it's just plain observation with no statistics at all, then I'm willing to believe. I'm willing to believe that when the Hubble telescope says they found another galaxy a cajillion miles away, that they probably have. If there is a statistical study by a physicist done to p, less than 0.000000, many zeros, 5, very tight statistical control, pretty darn likely, although slightly less likely than anything with statistics. If it's something only to p less than 0.05 in social psychology and so on, and too many disciplines, you should start having exceeding lack of trust. And then, is there disciplinary groupthink? Is there political groupthink? If you add those in as a rule of thumb, I would trust it very little. But I guess I do want to just say, trust is the crucial word. You should never take anything on faith in science. Um, but you should try wherever possible to see if science has been done well. And I guess, just to stick up for, happiness and all. Look, there are scientists who work properly. Not all of them are incompetent scofflaws. Yeah. Look, and one shouldn't go from trusting everything to trusting quite nothing. But I think trust but verify ain't bad. Other people on this.
Well, David, I would say, when it comes to trust in science, you want to trust the science process when it's operating correctly. So if you have a number of studies that reject the null hypothesis that, that there's an association, and you eventually you might want to believe that there is some true causation. But I wouldn't trust any individual study. I would want to know, what's the overall context that it's been in. I'd want to look at, what else has been said, sort of act like a Bayesian, you learn a little bit at a time. So over time, we can come to trust results. The problem is that when you have so much out there that's just associations, and as this project reports, false positive associations. Association is bad enough for trust. It's not causation. But when it's a false positive, obviously, then you've got real problems. So you really have to look at the process, not just individual papers. But that's just my take on it.
Let me comment. Trust in science has fallen considerably, and the first bifurcation that I do is, did the science come from industry or did it come from universities? Industry, they have skin in the game. You're not going to buy their product unless it works. Universities, there's no really skin in the game. I think if you're quite lazy or not really up on all the science, you should start with strong skepticism, particularly if it comes from a university. Beyond that, did they make their data available? Did they have a protocol before they did their study? These are questions that you have to delve into if you really want to take a serious look. But the man on the street that doesn't have the time, necessarily the skills, they should start with extreme skepticism. It's a fair thing to say.
And maybe I'll add some comments too, David. I spent over 2 decades in university, predominantly in graduate studies. And I always tried to teach the grad studies a very simple concept that, science is the methods. And if the methods are flawed, so is the evidence. And if you do not understand the methods of a study, don't use the evidence from that study. Very simple.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a different question to see if we can squeeze that in from Robert. It must be clear that peer review is failing miserably for reproducibility to be as bad as it is. What can be done here, if anything?
I've talked to editors on that very point. And there's a big editorial conference, and they all get together, and I suppose they drink beer and worry about things. Uh, Peer review is broken, quite simply. To tag a study saying it was peer reviewed adds, to my mind, very little credibility to the study itself. I mean, I've peer reviewed lots of papers, and sometimes I'll even ask for the data. Uh, and I'll take a couple of days to do a peer review of a paper. I think most peer reviews are done, they're not being paid. Why are you going to do a good job? You don't get your name on it. You don't say, well, I did this peer review and I'm getting credit for it. Peer review is, according to the editors, totally broken, and they do not have an alternative.
I will add that some of our stuff is about requiring transparency of data, transparency of methods. You can't get any money unless you go to the Open Science Foundation and put in your pre-registration. Um, and this, in effect, makes possible, everybody review, which is perhaps better than peer review. And that I think is what we want to be heading for, is to facilitate it so that everyone can review the data and the methods. And how shall I put this? It's always going to be difficult to spend the time to review somebody else's work. It just takes time. We're busy. We have kids to spank or something. Something to keep you off the streets. But the point is, the best way is to make it open so that you're increasing the number of people who will voluntarily think, hey, I want to spend some time. I'm curious. Let me take a look. No method is perfect, self-executing, or non-gameable, but I think moving to an everyone review model where what matters is, in effect, the preprint on archive, ARXIV, and then all of the continuing open access publications, never mind the scientific journals, and paying an arm and a leg to get access to them. We're moving there, I think, slowly anyway, but we should try to make that move as rapidly as possible. People, and there was another, there was a question from Ken Masugi about what the APA's role is doing in all this. And I think that means the American Psychological Association rather than something else. Anybody want to expand on that, what the APA has been doing?
I will just comment that the psychologists picked 100 studies and attempted to replicate them. And in the attempt to replicate, they increased the sample size and they increased the number of people attempting to replicate experimental studies. The end result was that 2/3 of the studies could not be replicated, and that's with increased sample size and so forth and so on. So I think if I were a psychologist, I would have been a little humble after all of that. And so I think science is not known for its humility, but they ought to get some.
I will say the argument for the psychologists is that they've actually started doing some self-examination more than other disciplines. And maybe all of the chemists and so on are just as bad, and they just haven't started to look at their own work. You should look for the good, heroic psychologists trying to reform the discipline. I'm going to shout out the name Lee Jussum to people. Go to Lee Jussum on Twitter, Dread Pirate, Jussum, is it? That's where you'll get an awful lot of good stuff on the self-reform movement in psychology. I want to get to sort of last minute thought, last thought. We're already 3:28, maybe 30 seconds or so. I'm going to say maybe the commenters first, then Stan and Warren, then yours truly. Marlo, you first.
Well, I think we're seeing a sea change in executive branch policy these days, in many dimensions. But one of them is the adoption of the gold standard in science executive order by President Trump, and it it actually mentions the reproducibility crisis as something that the agencies need to deal with. It talks about the need for the open exchange of ideas within the agencies in order to combat groupthink. It calls out RCP 8.5, that mischievous emission scenario, as an example of the reliance on implausible assumptions in policy-related research. And, and we're seeing the regulations that have been based on some of these irresponsible research endeavors being repealed at the EPA. I mean, you might say that the EPA was the worst actor, in the federal government. Maybe I'm not as familiar as others are with the health agencies, but now it looks like they are in rolling back the assaults on liberty that have been undertaken based on dubious science. They're, both the successor to the Clean Power Plan, which was really like the Clean Power Plan on steroids. They proposed to repeal that, and they're going to propose to repeal the Biden EPA's de facto gas and diesel powered car ban, which was also justified in terms of PM 2.5, air pollution, and climate change. So some big things are happening, and I just want to say I don't think they would be happening but for the great work that the NAS has done over the years, because you guys have built up the knowledge base. The very vocabulary that you've been using is evident in that executive order, which goes out to all federal agencies.
Thank you. Richard.
I'll just say where I finished up with some positive things, maybe some negative now. First of all, I do think this is wonderful. I hope you guys take this on the road. I think hopefully a lot of people will pick up these messages and carry them forward. I'm really concerned that a lot of the science that I see, the bad science that I see, has an underlying motivation. And the underlying motivation is, in many cases, we see this in torts particularly, but also in regulations. It's mistrust of business. It's dislike of the market system. And they don't mind bad science because that has a purpose, and the purpose to them is more important than getting the science right. So that worries me, and I hope that, as people pick up this message, they look for those underlying motivations and expose them when they do occur. The last thing I want to say is thank you for mentioning the food frequency questionnaire. Here's how bad that is. 62% of the people that report on the 24-hour, what did you eat? They don't report enough food eaten to stay alive. That's why that is bad data. So thank you all for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Stan.
I will say, keeping in the technical lane, anyone can pick up a paper and count how many questions are implied by what's going on. The technology to do a p-value plot is really very simple. And those two techniques together give you a shot at establishing a negative claim. The central paradigm of science is you have to produce a positive result. And if you can't do it many times, well, you think, well, maybe I'll just do something else. But the counting and p-value plots are a technology that virtually anyone can apply to a question where there's a lot of data and start establishing, counter to normal science, negativity. And I think that's a good technical contribution that Warren and I have made, along with David, supporting us. Yes.
Warren?
Well, maybe just to, follow up with, there is a lot of bad science that has crowded out good science in the literature. And it's going to take this continued awareness with, the public and researchers that this is the case, and we need to do better.
Thank you. And I guess I'll just say, we love science. We love good science. The nature of science policy is that you end up criticizing bad science. But we wouldn't do that if we didn't care and if we didn't want it done right. And gosh, look, and we care about the policy, the bad policy results, but oh golly, look, there are what, hundreds of thousands, millions of scientists out there by now who continue to do science because they love learning about the world and sharing that, sharing their love. We're with them. Stan and Young are among them, practicing, statistics, public health, and everything. Um, Richard and Marlowe have been spending their lives trying to make good science and science policy happen. So I guess I just want to say, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that everything we do, it's because we love science. We love what science can bring the world, can bring our country. We love good science policy. And that's the basis for everything we're doing. So I guess those are my final words. And then just to say, thank you to everyone. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, the participants. Thank you again, the Roop Foundation and Mark Henry for making this entire series of reports possible. And just to say again, questions, if you still got them, randall@nas.org, and I'll be glad to forward them. And you can see this on the NAS YouTube within 24 hours.